Right, so we'll start this over again then. Yeah,
Yep.
I think it would be a good idea to start again. So, Paul Halliday, and I'm very passionate about projects like Ionic, NativeScript, everything app development, especially in the JavaScript framework side of things. Today we have Justin Willis, and he's going to be talking about Ionic, the future of Ionic, Stencil, and maybe even stuff about the supposed Avocado. So, Justin, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Dev Relations here at Ionic. So I am on Twitter. I talk about all the cool stuff they're working on. Do blog posts, podcasts such as this, videos, the Ionic show, which we just did Friday. And I basically talk about all things Ionic, Stencil, all the new stuff we're working on, and try to help people be as successful as they can with their with Ionic and all of our tools.
Yeah, so you talk about the Ionic show there. Can people go back and look at that? Is that anywhere on the internet?
Yeah, actually, let me. I can actually pull up the link real quick and put it in the YouTube live chat. Give me just 1 second here, and let me go here. So yeah, we did it last Friday. It was live streamed. It was the first live streamed Ionic show we ever did. It turned out really good. There are some things we're going to tweak in the future, like the quality's not the video quality. The audio quality is great. The video quality could be better, but I think for our first live stream went pretty well. So, and it's not letting me put web addresses into the YouTube live stream. So you can actually just go to the Ionic channel on YouTube. So it's just should be just like youtube.com/Ionic, I would think. Or maybe /C Ionic. Let's see here. Nope. Ionic. Give me just 1 second. There we go. Okay, so yeah, you can go to youtube.com/C/Ionic framework. And right there on the homepage that pops up, it should be the top thing that's there. It's just called Ionic Show, and you can see it was streamed 2 days ago, so Friday.
Yeah,
So definitely go check that out.
So I mean, so if you got, are you guys going to start putting up sort of more content? Is this going to be sort of a more recent thing? So if people subscribe, can they expect more Ionic shows in the future?
Definitely, yeah. So you should definitely subscribe. We plan on doing a lot more Ionic shows. I know there was a pretty big gap between this one and the one before it, but that we're not going to let that happen again. We plan on doing one maybe every other month. Maybe, yeah, we're going to shoot for every other month. But if we have a lot to talk about, we may do two in a row. It just kind of depends. But it's definitely not going to be basically a year until the next one, like the last one was. So
Yeah, well, a lot did change in the last year, and in the web and with Ionic themselves. I mean,
exactly.
I mean, like, so myself, I built an Ionic One application back when I had a job in the sort of Durham police, and we basically made a sort of crime application. And we found that Ionic 1 was really good, AngularJS was really good, but one of the things that we did miss was TypeScript. And,
Gotcha.
I mean, static types in JavaScript. Is that one of the reasons why you chose Angular 2? Or was it simply, we have AngularJS, we're simply just going to follow the times and go with Angular 2? If that makes sense
Yeah,
with
yeah.
the more recent versions of Ionic.
Yeah, I got you. So it was kind of so if we go back in history a little bit, when Ionic One, so we started out actually with this thing called Codica, which was a jQuery drag and drop kind of framework kind of thing. So at that time, it's always been our goal to where you can take like Ion button, for example, drop that into an HTML file, and then you just have this nice design button that you can that just looks nice and you can use, and you can make great apps with it. So back when Ionic 1 first started to become a thing, AngularJS was like the big thing. It just like hit stable. It was backed by Google. There was tons of money and tons of developers behind it. And great team too. And they worked directly with us, and we built this awesome thing called Ionic 1. So it was only natural. We had a lot of success with Ionic 1. We really liked AngularJS. It wasn't perfect. There was some runtime performance stuff that, we had to work around a little bit and make some best practices for. But overall, it was a great framework, and a lot of people actually still use it. We built Ionic 1, had great success. We really liked AngularJS. So it was really only natural that when the Angular team came to us and was like, hey, we're building this new thing called Angular 2. It's really cool. Why don't y'all try it out? Let us know, and maybe you can, rebuild Ionic and Angular 2. So that was like super early days for Angular. It was, very, very beta. and we loved it. So we decided, Ionic 2 Plus is going to be built with Angular 2. So it kind of just happened just because like it was cool and it was the Angular team, and we had great success with Angular. So why not upgrade to the latest, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's one of the powers of Angular 2, isn't it? Where like, you can take one of these projects, you can build a component, and then of course, you can just drop that component into the project. And
Pretty much, yeah.
yeah, I mean that's the thing. But other people want to use Vue.js, React, and all these other stuff. So how's Ionic themselves? How's Ionic the project sort of adapting to all these other libraries in the future?
Yep. So that's a really good question actually. So that kind of continues the history of Ionic, right? So we built Ionic 2, and we're on Ionic 3.8, I think now is the latest release. Um,
392, I think maybe.
392, there we go.
394,
See,
something like that.
there we go. So we've had great success with it. We love Angular. It's been going great. People have built there's apps like Untapped, which is like a social network around like beer. There's
There's
Market
Swirkit as well,
Watch, Swirkit.
which
Yes,
yeah,
Swirkit's a really nice one. So yeah, people have had a lot of success with it. They're building really cool stuff with it. But we love Angular, but we've always wanted, like I said, that goal that we started with was you take an ion button, you plop it into an HTML file, maybe add a script tag or something, and it just works. And with Angular, although Angular is great, first of all, not everybody uses Angular. Like Angular is a great framework, but there's a lot of other great frameworks too, like React, Preact. I'm a pretty big fan of Preact, Vue.js, etc. And when you use a framework, you can't really just plop like an ion button into a page, right? Like you have to go all in with the framework, which is great, but it goes against our original goal. And then, like I said, we want there's all these great frameworks, and we want people to be able to use Ionic everywhere. So that's when we got into web components. So when Ionic 1 first became a thing, web components weren't really a thing yet. Like they were kind of like being spec'd out and stuff, but it just wasn't in browsers yet. So about I don't know, a couple of months ago, I guess hasn't been that long. We took a hard look at web components and said, hey, web components are not only in Chrome, but they're in Safari now. And web components, give us that original power that we were looking for, right? Where you can take an ion button, throw it in an HTML page, add one script tag, and things just work. And this also enables you to, use Ionic anywhere. So if you like Vue and you want to have a nice like UI layer with a bunch of pre-designed components, you can use Ionic, and you shouldn't be held back by which framework you prefer, held from using Ionic. So we built this thing called, I guess this kind of goes into Stencil a little bit.
sure.
So we built this web component compiler called Stencil, which is just a tool that we built to enable us to build web components that have cool things like lazy loading, code splitting, etc. built in. But at the end of the day, it just outputs a web component. So there's, it's very lightweight, like extremely lightweight, like around 5.5 kilobytes lightweight. So that's like nothing. And yeah, allows you to build really cool components. So we use Stencil to, we're actually in the process of porting all the Ionic components that you know and love. So, Ion button, Ion header, Ion modal, etc., all to web components using Stencil. And this will, there's an Ionic core package. It's actually already on NPM, and I know Paul has some content around how you can use it. It's still beta, but it's out there.
Yeah,
Yep, go Paul.
yeah. So the Ionic core package itself. I mean, like I've been playing around with Vue and I think a few other things like Angular 1.x, and I found it useful. I can put in a web component, and obviously, like I said, it's in beta. What do we do when it comes to things like the TOS controllers and the way that the nav controllers, for example? Are you letting basically Vue.js handle that? Are you still bringing over the nav controller in that circumstance?
Definitely.
Can you tell me a bit about that?
Sure. So that's actually something that we're actively working on. It's like how our nav controller works outside of something like Angular. So we have like Ionic Angular, and nav controller and that project is very, Angular specific. The way it works, the implementation is very specific to Angular.
Sure.
So that's actually something that we're working on. We're not super sure how we want Ion Nav to work outside of an Ionic Angular project. but kind of, like you can now, and this is definitely something that we want people to be able to do. So, if you're using React or Vue and you really like Vue Router, or you really like React Router, you can totally use React Router and build an entire app, using Ionic components. But for your router, you can use React Router.
Sure.
Um, so, so that's definitely, one use case for sure. And Ion Nav, it's still, still up in the air if that's going to be, you know, yeah, that's
Yeah.
kind of it's still a work in progress.
Yeah, I mean, because that's what it's about, isn't it? I mean, kind of got to decide, I suppose, where Ionic fits in the sort of project outside of Angular, because, like I said, it's like you said, it's tightly integrated with Angular when it comes to things like the nav controller. But
Yep.
maybe when we go to integrate with things like Vue and where web components are, and I mean, Stencil has a router, doesn't it? I think too, and we'll talk about that in the
Yep.
future. You know, it might be that Vue.js and you just keep the Vue router and that's the best thing for you. Or maybe, if you're used to using Ionic with the Ion Nav, if you do make it a web component type style, uh, that might be better for you in your project. I suppose it comes down to personal preference and where you are as a developer.
Definitely. I totally
You know,
agree. And yeah, you got it right on the head.
if it's viable to implement that way, obviously, you know what I mean, because it might be that it becomes an anti-pattern, but
Definitely, yeah,
but
for
yeah, of
sure.
course. And I think that was one of the things that onboarded me, especially into development, was that Ionic is just so simple to get a project up and running, and the end result of doing that. You have a mobile application that basically you run one command in the CLI and you're ready to go. And I think that's if you can then take that experience but change it so it's any single sort of framework that you're interested in, I think you're definitely going to see a lot of success in that area.
Yeah, definitely. So I should say, like, one of the biggest reasons for us to go to web components is that it simplifies things even further. So I always like to say, like, the Ionic way of doing things is we're always striving to make things simpler and faster. By moving to web components, that's just enforcing that even more. So, it becomes as easy to use Ionic. It becomes just putting a script tag in an HTML file and then throwing, HTML like Ion button into that HTML file, and it just renders, and it looks like a nice Ionic app. Moving to web components, we're just working on making everything even simpler than it already is. Yeah.
Yeah, if you move to web components itself, let's say I'm an Angular developer. This is a question that I get quite often: is it going to affect me when we talk about Ionic 4, when we talk about moving to
Yep.
Stencil and stuff? Will it affect me as an Angular developer? The upgrade process, you know what I mean? Because when we,
Definitely.
we talk about Ionic 1 to Ionic 2, obviously that was a complete different sort of framework and
Yep.
that type of thing. Is it going to be as big as that, or is it simply just going to be changing some tag names and maybe, or can we expect maybe next to no updates? Do you know what I'm saying? Upgrades from our
Yeah,
side?
definitely.
Um,
Definitely. Yeah. So I should say, so Ionic Core, that is the npm package that is all the Ionic components. That's the package that you can use anywhere. So you can, use it in Vue, React, just like we talked about. Ionic Angular 4 is going to be the same Ionic Angular that you already know, but under the hood, all the Ionic components will be web components. So we'll actually be using that Ionic Core package in Ionic Angular. So you'll still be writing Angular code just like you always have, but all the Ionic components underneath the hood will be web components. The upgrade process. Ionic Angular 3 uses Angular for everything. Ionic Angular 4, you use Angular for your code. Our code is web components. The cool thing is the way that we decided to, the way that, because web components and how awesome they are, the upgrade process is actually relatively easy. So you actually don't even need to really know that web components are under the hood, because all the code that you write will always just be the same Angular code that you've always written in your app. The changes, we're trying to keep them always as of always to a bare minimum. So I will say that it's not going to be anything near the Ionic 1 to Ionic 2 Ionic 2 jump. We acknowledge that was a big jump. We think it's worth it. Angular is a lot faster, especially runtime wise, than Angular JS, but it's definitely a big jump. And if you have a huge app, that can definitely be a huge, huge difference,
yeah,
and a lot of engineering time. So with Ionic Angular 3 to Ionic Angular 4, it should be mostly like find and replace kind of things. So it should be, so instead of just, so like Ion button, for example, has an attribute called block. and it allows you to expand the button to the edges of the page. In Ionic Angular 4, that is going to be expand equals block. So it's little things like that, little like find and replace, like attribute changes and stuff like that. But we're trying to keep the APIs that you already know and love as close to the same as we can. So it won't be anything like the jump from Ionic 1 to Ionic 2, and we're trying to keep it mostly to find and replace type things.
Sure, that's good. I mean, that's good to hear because it
Definitely.
it is a question I hear a lot, and people are so whenever they hear like it almost seems that some people are sort of resistant to change because the front end I suppose moves so fast for a
Definitely.
lot of people where change in version numbers is a scary thing, and
Definitely.
so they hear Ionic 4 and it becomes a little bit scary. So
Yeah,
that's good to
for
know,
sure.
though. Yeah, that's good
And
to
I,
know.
and I should say, yeah, I should say too that like the cool thing is, so you're going to upgrade, right? So you have your Ionic Angular 3 app, you upgrade to Ionic Angular 4. The benefits you get are should be much smaller bundle sizes. So the biggest thing you should be shipping at that point is actually Angular itself, and then faster runtime too because of our async rendering that we have built in to web components that are built with Stencil. So you upgrade, you get these awesome advantages, and only things you really have to do is some find and replace changes. And like I said, you don't even have to know that it's web components under the hood. All you get to see is, hey, my bundles are smaller and my app is faster.
Yeah,
So
yeah, it's
pretty
really
cool.
good. I mean, it's good for people like me as well who are content creators, and when something
That's
changes, like that's the scariest thing ever because now we have a
exactly.
course that just doesn't work. And I experienced that myself with Firebase recently, where the real-time database changed to a new API,
Yep.
and so did Firestore. Firestore came out, and it invalidates a lot for a lot of people. And it's hard for people to upgrade because people also don't have time to upgrade in a lot of circumstances. They don't have time to sit and read about how to change things. They just basically want to make a project. They have a goal and they want something like Ionic to help them with that. So that's good news. When it comes to sort of web components, and we talked about this before, with Ionic 1 and Angular 1.x, do you find that when you port Ionic fully to web components, Ionic 1 would then be able to use this inside of Angular?
Definitely.
So is this
Uh,
something you're looking at for those people who are maybe stuck in Ionic 1 land, maybe for enterprise reasons?
yep. So yeah, that's a really good question too. So this has actually been, so I should say that upfront, and a cool site you can check out is customelementseverywhere.com.
Yep.
So that's a site built by one of the people on the Polymer team, and it kind of tells you how good web components work in certain frameworks. So upfront, Angular 1, was built before web components were really a thing. And its native web component support is actually not that great. But Max, our one of the co-founders of Ionic, he has this pet project that he's working on to make web components work really nicely in Angular 1. And the whole goal of that project is to allow people who may be stuck on Ionic 1, so maybe they just have a huge app and they just can't spend the engineering time to upgrade it to Ionic Angular 2 or rewrite it in Stencil or something like this. Or just for enterprise reasons, just can't upgrade. So what this would allow you to do is upgrade the Ionic components. So you'll be using, the latest Ionic components and get all the nice UI updates, but still have all your, Ionic 1 code there. So that is it's not the highest priority for sure. The highest priority is getting Ionic Core and
Yeah.
Stencil out. But it is it does work on Max's machine, and it's going to be pretty cool. But it's not the highest priority, but it's definitely one of our goals is to be able to help out those people that are still stuck on Ionic 1.
Yeah, I mean, do you happen to have any sort of data to see how many people, just sort of a sort of idea of how many people are still using Ionic One, and that's something, is it still being used a lot in production? Do you know?
I actually don't have like good numbers on that.
I suppose it's quite hard to find out, but yeah,
It,
but there's something I was certainly like thinking a lot is like, you know, is Ionic One still a thing for a lot of people? Because I imagine it is in sort of these older firms that maybe have a um, smaller engineering team and sort of can't really afford to then rewrite everything that they have.
yep. Yeah, so I will say that Ionic 1 is obviously it's in maintenance mode. But we actually do still release. So a couple of months ago there was kind of a showstopper bug. Um, I think Chrome changed something or something like that, and it broke some old Ionic 1 code. So we did release an update. Oh, and actually, so iPhone 10 too. So iPhone 10 broke like everybody's apps.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
um, So we did an update to Ionic 1 to bring iPhone 10 support to Ionic 1. So it is in maintenance mode. We don't do active development on it, but if there is like a big breaking change or something like that, we do support issues and stuff like that. So if you are still stuck on Ionic 1, you're not going to be getting any new stuff, but you will get bug fixes for things that are like showstoppers. Yeah, and like I said, one of the goals is eventually to be able to, because we're moving to web components, is allow you to upgrade all your Ionic components, but still keep your Ionic 1 code.
Yes, I mean, so that's a good thing. I mean, by the time we hit this sort of Ionic 4 stage, the folks at Ionic 1, I mean, that are currently on Ionic 1, can be excited about that. So that's a good thing.
Definitely. Yep.
So we talked a lot about Stencil and we talked a lot about the benefits of Stencil, but we haven't really looked at how people can get started writing projects with Stencil and writing their own components. And maybe
Yep.
once they write their own components, I mean, we can ask a few questions here. How does somebody like me, I've wrote my own components. How do I get it out there for people to use? Is it simply put it on GitHub? Is there a list? Is there a site or anything like that? Is there
Definitely.
something you're thinking about? Yeah. So just how can we get started?
Yep. So you can go to stenciljs.com. So actually, yeah, stenciljs.com. If you go there, we have a getting started button. You can click on that and it gets you started using Stencil. We also have starters, and that, the starters are mentioned in the Stencil site. So I should say, so Stencil, like I said, it's a web component compiler. It allows you to build web components that have cool things like virtual DOM, async rendering, data binding, TypeScript, JSX, etc., all built in. It's super tiny. The code that gets output is just standard, like JavaScript, custom elements code. So you can do cool things with it. So you can build components that you can share around. So like I said, you get started with the Stencil component starter. You build your component, then you can put that on npm, and people can either just use a script tag and use like a CDN to get a hold of it, or they can install it and then just script tag from wherever they installed it into their app. We also have if you go to stenciljs.com and our docs, you can go down and you can see like Angular integration, which kind of goes through like how you would pull in web components built with Stencil into an Angular app. We're working on making those docs a little bit more generic so that you can, it shows how to pull them into like React app or something like that. Something that may have like a really custom webpack config and, has special places where you need to put like a build directory where the file should go, etc. But yeah, it's usually just as easy as npm install whatever component you want to use, and then you can just copy those to your build directory and then just link to the main loader file. So that's that. Yeah, that's kind of how you can build components, and then you put them on npm and people can use them. There's also an awesome stencil collection on GitHub. So if you just type in, I think it's awesome stencil.js on GitHub, you'll see it. There's a lot of cool projects that people have built with Stencil on there. So, for example, there's a web share API, a component that wraps the web share API. There's components that show you the prices of popular cryptocurrencies if you're into like Bitcoin and stuff. And yeah, it's pretty cool, and you can definitely put your stuff on there. And yeah, that's building components with it. The other kind of cool thing that we're going to be pushing in the next few months is actually building whole apps with Stencil. So if you want to go all in on web components, so say you have like a new project or something, especially if it's a PWA where performance is very very critical, you can actually build a whole app with web components using Stencil. So we have like a Stencil router. That way you can have routing in the app. We have a Stencil app starter actually that has like the router built in. It has some examples of how to use the router, et cetera, in the code. It's kind of like the Ionic Angular blank starter, but it's using Stencil. And yeah, that shows you how you can build whole apps using Stencil. And that's going to give you, if you want to go all in on web components, that's going to give you really blazing fast performance, low time and runtime. I've been kind of throwing around the idea of like an Ionic PWA toolkit, which is the Stencil app starter for the logic, Ionic core for the UI, so you get all the nice Ionic components, and then something that we just released on the Ionic show Friday, which is Ionic PWA hosting, which is a zero config, best practices built in, click a button, and your app is deployed hosting service. Yeah, that way you can go from 0 to 100, build a PWA from start to scratch, It's fast. It's easy. All the best practices are built in. You don't have to configure anything. You don't have to worry about how you're importing stuff, etc. It's just fast by default.
That sounds quite exciting. So effectively, what you're saying is that we have this sort of web component compiler. We write these things in TSX, so this is TypeScript, and effectively what ends up happening is it compiles down to just a native web component. We can
Yep.
then just pull it in any sort of project we want. So if we're building just a normal JavaScript project, we can use that. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. So because of the awesomeness of web components, pop a script tag in, and you're using your component.
Yeah, that's awesome. So there must be a catch, though. This is the
Um,
thing. There must be a catch. Is there any reason somebody would not want to use web components, or is it literally just what you just got to get with the times?
yes, I mean, I've talked to this about to people before. Like, so if you're considering, starting a new app, right, a new PWA, first of all, you need to look at, so do you have a lot of legacy code written in a specific framework? So if you have like a lot of legacy code built in, AngularJS or something like that, do you have the engineering time, if you do want to go all in on web components, to port that stuff? If you don't, then you shouldn't do it. I mean, if you don't have the time and the money, you don't, it's
Yeah, of course.
it's not there. Um, and if you another a good reason to if you rely on like rely heavily on a feature specific to a certain framework. So say that you rely heavily on like observables or something like that in Angular, or I don't know, some other
Yeah.
specific feature like dependency injection or something like that that's specific to a specific framework. Then it might be better for you to just stick with that framework, and that's totally cool. And the cool thing is you can still use web components that you build with Stencil in that framework.
Yeah, exactly. That's the
Um,
point. Because you can take the components that you're writing with Stencil and just put them in that framework anyway, can't you? I mean, that's one of the great
exactly.
benefits about it.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and that's totally cool. You can use that framework. Or, if you don't have a lot of legacy code, if you don't rely on some, developer experience, some feature thing that only one framework has, I find that it works really well for PWAs especially, or any time that performance is just extremely critical. Then I would recommend going, full on web components. It is a little bit lower level, so you're not going to get, things like dependency injection and stuff like that.
Sure.
But I find that 90% of what you need is there. It's written in TypeScript, so you get all that, all the goodness that TypeScript provides, like, in editor code, it shows you exactly what's going on at compile time. Or if you have a good editor like VS Code before compile time, actually, instead of runtime. And we use JSX, so just like you would in React or something like that, you get all the benefits of JSX. So like being able to embed JS directly into your template, and you get async rendering, you get code splitting, you get lazy loading all by default, completely zero config. So yeah, I would say the catch really is if you just rely on something very heavily that a certain framework has. But if you do, that's totally cool. You can still use some Stencil components in that app. That's totally fine. But if you want to try it out, you want to go all in on web components, I would definitely check out the Stencil App Starter if you want to build a whole app. And I think it's pretty fun to work with.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it's going to make what it already has, but it's definitely going to make a lot of waves in the future. So
Definitely.
we talked about we talked about the sort of Ionic PWA hosting service, and we said that we can basically take this Ionic application and maybe deploy it using the new Ionic Pro service that you guys are sort of pushing a lot lately.
Yep.
Can you tell me a bit about Ionic Pro and how maybe when we look in our applications at the moment and maybe we push them up to Firebase hosting, why
Yep.
would we want to change from Firebase hosting to sort of the Ionic PWA hosting?
Definitely. Yeah. So Ionic Pro is our pro suite of backend services basically that allow you to build better, faster, easier Ionic apps. So we have a lot of services like monitoring, for example, that will tell you exactly. So if you have an app in production, you have monitoring turned on, it's going to give you live in your Pro console errors that are happening in people's apps, and it actually points you directly to the line in your TypeScript where the error is happening. That way you deploy something. Oh, there's an error. I'm seeing it. It's popping up in my dash. I can fix it real quick, and then I can do something like deploy. So deploy is another service that Ionic Pro offers, which allows you to fix your code, push it up to Ionic Pro, hit a button that says deploy, and you can deploy that code in real time to people's apps. So if you have an update, you don't have to wait on the App Store. You don't have to wait on the Play Store. You can push an update live to someone's app, as long as it's on the JavaScript side of things. If it's on the native side of things, then you will still need to do a traditional App Store update. But you can use deploy to deploy live updates to your apps, to your apps in real time. So it's services like these that Ionic Pro offers. So Ionic Pro, I should say, is paid. We do have a free plan. The free plan is obviously limited compared to some of the paid plans. But we find that if you're serious about your app, you want some of these backend services such as monitoring, that it's a pretty good investment. And I will say, so one of the new services we're working on is Ionic Pro PWA hosting. So upfront, I love Firebase hosting. I think it's great. But we, like I said earlier, we have the Ionic way of doing things, which is keeping things as easy and as simple as we can. And that's what we've applied to Ionic PWA hosting. So Ionic PWA hosting, basically, it gives you the best built-in practices, all the stuff that you should be doing, but might be kind of hard to configure yourself. So like HTTP2, H2 push, CDN, etc. All built in, zero config. You don't have to change anything. You just hit a button, and then magic goes on behind the scenes, and boom, you have a nice, fast PWA that's ready for people to start using. I just find that it makes it a really simple process. So Firebase also supports H2 push, but it's a manual config, and that's totally fine if you know what you're doing and you're comfortable setting up H2 push yourself. But who doesn't like just pressing a button compared to setting up a config? So I just find that Ionic Pro PWA hosting is a nice alternative to other things like Firebase hosting, which are also great products. If you have a pro account, it just ties in really nicely. There's a button on your dash, you press the button, and boom, it's ready to go.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things. I mean, like you said it yourself, with regards to Ionic, it's just about keeping things simple, just so that people can be onboarded quickly, can be building applications that they want to build, and not really have to worry about infrastructure.
Exactly.
But when you say like automated sort of deployment and that type of thing, when you say sort of easy to configure and stuff, will we as the developer have the ability to configure that ourselves if we want to?
Yep. So that's actually what we planned out this morning. So we will, so let me go into the technical details a little bit here. So when I say best practices, I'm talking about stuff like H2 push, for example. So by default, the Stencil compiler will output a config file that Ionic Pro will look at and say, okay, these are the files that need to be pushed to get the best load time on first view. And it will go ahead and auto set up the correct headers for you and make sure that those files are being pushed. But say that you want to customize that, or say you want to put some custom cache rules or something like that in your config. That's also going to be totally possible. You can set that up yourself. It'll just be a JSON config file, just like a Firebase.json config file. You can completely customize it if you want to, or if you just want to get a nice fast PWA up there, you don't really need to configure anything, then you don't have to. It's zero config needed, 100% config if you want to.
Yeah, and that's it, isn't it? I mean, as long as you have that sort of ability first to sort of deploy or whatever you want to do, and it's already got like sort of the best practices based in, then you're good to go.
Yep.
So when it comes to Ionic, somebody's asked in the chat there, will the free version of Ionic be always available forever? So will Ionic always have a sort of free open source version?
Oh yeah. So the open source Ionic framework, all of our open source tools, Stencil is open source. Those will always be open source. We are at heart an open source company. You do have to make money, So paid services are nice. But all of our open source stuff will always be open source and there for anyone to use. And you don't have to use any of the Ionic Pro services if you don't want to. We just find that it provides some nice things to help you build an awesome app. All of our open source stuff will always be open source. That will never change.
That's good. That's good news. So tell me a little bit about the Ionic database then. I remember we using that back. I think it was a few
Yep.
months ago now. That was in beta. Did that not pan out? Is it something you're looking to do again in the future, maybe with the Ionic Pro movement, or is it something that you just leaving other people to sort of champion
Yeah,
in the communities?
that is deprecated. It's we're not going forward with that. We found that up against something like Firebase has an awesome database. They had the real time database, and now they have Firestore, which I played with over the weekend. It's pretty cool. We found that we just what our product didn't really offer anything that was different than theirs. So we decided to move our resources elsewhere into things like monitoring and view and et cetera, deploy, all that good stuff. So yeah, that's deprecated, and it's not in the plan to bring that back anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it is hard when you're trying to compete with these big guys who are literally just focusing on having like the perfect database with loads
Oh
of
yeah,
integrations. Do you know what I mean? That is
oh yeah,
super
oh
difficult.
yeah, and and we're a
Yeah,
startup, right? Like
yeah,
we're
of
we're
course. It's
trying
not like
to
you
find
have.
our niche.
Yeah,
So
yeah, exactly. That's the thing. I mean, so it's one of those things. But I think I like the idea of that, though. I really like the idea of pushing the database out as a sort of beta product, seeing how it works, seeing whether you can compete, and if you can't, just simply saying, look, it's deprecated. If you use this in production, well, we said it was in beta. We said it was in alpha. So
pretty
so
much, yeah,
so,
pretty
so
much.
but yeah. So we got another question. What do you think about testing in Ionic? Is it necessary? Are you working on an out of the box solution?
Definitely. So there is a starter, and there's a bunch of community-led projects around this too. Like Josh, he put together, Joshua Moroni, he put together a very nice Ionic testing starter. It is something that we could probably build in by default a little bit more. But yeah, there's testing solutions out there. I would just look at Joshua Moroni's blog. He's got a blog on there. And then if you look in our starters, there's a starters repo on the Ionic repo, or Ionic organization on GitHub. You can see the testing starter there, and that allows you to test your Ionic apps. Is it necessary? I would say that that just depends on your team and how you're developing. Really, a lot of teams are moving towards a more test-driven development where you write a bunch of tests and then you know develop and make sure that those you develop to get those tests passing basically. So you set up all these tests, you know what you want to happen, and then you develop to get those tests to pass. I think that's pretty cool. But I've written plenty of apps that have absolutely zero unit tests. So it really just depends on your setup and your team and what you're wanting to do.
Yeah, I've been there myself. I've been on projects where we have no tests, and we're stringing together the best project we can because you've always got to say to yourself in this circumstance, if you say, well, I don't have time for tests, then the answer to that is, well, probably is you have a worse end product that you spend more time fixing. So
There you
you've
go.
always got this like sort of tug of war happening between you and the sort of should I test. I think it's just about sort of understanding how, like, what things to unit test, what's really important, what things
Yep.
that you really need to test, and what things maybe you don't, and where you could, of course, put your resources elsewhere. I mean, the
Yep.
red,
Absolutely agreed.
yeah, the red green refactor type thing, that is, is a good methodology. I like that. But yeah, I think Josh has a decent repo up, so I would definitely check that for getting started with actually integrating tests to Ionic projects. And it's something I need to look at as far as actually making a video on it and that sort of thing. And yeah, it's something I could definitely do. I mean, I've been using Wallaby lately quite a bit, and that allows us
Nice.
to sort of automatically see the results of our tests inside of VS Codes. That's something
Very cool.
I definitely recommend if you're into that. So we are getting onto other things that I'd like to talk about, such as Avocado, which is.
Yep.
uh,
So
but we have a question before that, apparently. Any idea if Ionic V4 will still have its own CLI, or just leave it to the desired framework for scaffolding / CLI? I suppose this is a really important question because you're kind of saying like, hey, how do we integrate Ionic into all of these other different frameworks, but at the same time have a CLI which is easy to use and sort of scales across that? Can you tell me a little
definitely.
bit about that?
Yeah, so this is also first just hey Alex, I see Alex for all the time around the Stencil Slack, etc. Um, so yeah, that's a really good question. It's something that honestly we're still thinking a little bit about. So at this moment, Ionic V4, which I'm guessing. So I actually let me back up a touch. So Ionic Angular v4 will definitely still use the Ionic CLI that you are already using. But Ionic Core, that is just a npm package, just a collection of web components. So it doesn't really make sense to have a CLI around that since it's just an npm package. But if you want to use like Ionic Core, so all those Ionic components in another app, our thinking on it now is that you should just use whatever CLI that framework has. So like React, they have a Create React app, which is a great CLI. It sets up a very nice React app for you. It handles all of that Webpack config stuff for you. Yeah, that's our thinking right now is you should just use whatever the framework your framework of choice provides. Also the Vue CLI. Vue CLI is freaking awesome. So yeah, that's just what we're thinking now is if you want to use Ionic Core, you want to have those Ionic components in like your Vue app, you should just use the Vue CLI. And I've been playing around with creating like a template for the Vue CLI to where you install Vue start or whatever the command is to start a new app with the Vue CLI, and you can choose the Ionic template, which will already have the Ionic components built in. So yeah, it's we're still thinking about it, but that's our thinking currently is that you should just use whatever CLI your framework provides.
Yeah, I think it's good because I mean the Vue CLI itself. I think you can point it as essentially a sort of GitHub username and repo. I think so. You could basically do Ionic/Ionic starter, and it's just
Yep.
automatically integrated with the Vue CLI. So yeah, it is a good question, and I really don't. It's one that I suppose you could have an answer for where you go and develop your own solution for sort of
Exactly.
each
Yep.
one, or maybe. But if you're trying to have this sort of this idea of hey, we just develop these components once and they sort of run everywhere. You're always going to have, yeah, again, we'll use the tug of war example of, we want to serve everybody, but at the same sense, you have to sort of put your resources in an area which makes sense for everybody, if that makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree. And yeah, like I mean, it's all of this stuff is still beta, so we're still thinking about it, but it is we are pretty decided on a lot of this stuff, but it's it could always change for sure.
Yeah, of course, and that's what it's about, isn't it? Before we jump into talking about other things, we do actually have one other question which I did miss, and that was, what about connecting Stencil components to databases? Is this something that we leave the application to do, and we maybe use the Stencil component as a sort of presentational component, or is it okay to just have HTTP calls inside of the component? What's the
Yeah.
sort of methodology about going around that?
Yeah, so like I said before, so you can build whole apps with Stencil, right? So you can use a Stencil app starter and build a whole app. So I'm a fan of Firebase for the database stuff, especially Firestore. And Stencil web components are just like an Angular component where you can do HTTP calls, you can call out to Firebase, etc. inside the component. You can do the same thing with web components. I've just been using the Firebase JavaScript SDK. Sorry about the Slack notification there. Yeah, Firebase JavaScript SDK to make calls out to Firestore, etc.
Sure.
And I find that works very well. And you can also do fetch calls just like you can in any like an Angular frame or an Angular component or anything like that. Yeah, you can totally call out the database. I would love if like so Polymer has like the Polymer Firebase components that kind of wraps the Firebase APIs. If someone wants to wrap the Firebase APIs with Stencil, that would also be really cool
Yeah.
too. But the cool thing is, at the end of the day, it's just JavaScript. So you can totally, you can call out to whatever database. You can make fetch calls to any API, etc. Anything you can do on the web, you can do in a web component.
Yeah, so I mean that's the thing about web components, isn't it? We can just sort of develop these entire applications with them. We could even make our own like private NPM repositories as an
Yep,
organization. And I have to
definitely.
imagine if we're a big organization and we have some sort of design components that maybe we want to use buttons or input forms or anything like that, we can almost make we can make an entire UI library and just basically have it to ourselves. Which if we have a subset, so maybe we're using like squads as an example. We have this team over here that is using Vue, this other team that's using React. They don't have to conform to whatever framework Ionic
Yep,
uses in this circumstance, or Stencil, or anything that we use, because web components.
exactly,
so,
exactly. And
yeah, so that's the benefit, I guess.
Yep, I definitely agree. And I think you point out a really cool use case for web components, right? So I've talked with multiple big teams that are working in big corporations, and they all, there may be like 5 different teams within this corporation, and everybody's using a different framework, right? So you have one team that's using Angular, you have one team that's using React, you have one team that's maybe using like jQuery or something like that. And they're all writing the same components, right? So like you're writing a date time in Angular, and then one team is writing a date time in React. So one cool thing that Web Components allows you to do, and one use case that I think is freaking awesome, is you build one web component that is the datetime component. You can send that off to your design team. They can design it for you, and then you know that design is going to be, specific to your, corporation's design plan or design guidelines, and it's going to look the same in each framework. And then, instead of everybody writing their own components, you write one component and then everybody can share it. And like I said, the design is going to be right on no matter what, the team is using. And it cuts down on, code. What's the word I'm looking for? Code or effort. Everybody,
Duplication.
spending
So
time. Yeah,
yeah.
effort duplication. Yeah, everybody's spending the time doing the same thing. When really you could just build one component and everybody use it.
Yeah, but that's a really good point, and I think how many times is that same button component being developed, or how many times is that same input
Exactly.
component? Or let's say autocomplete as an example. If we type autocomplete into GitHub, I bet like we get thousands of
Yep.
examples, and
Agreed.
and that's the thing. I mean, like your company just needs to make this once. It almost feels like cheating if you think about it. It almost feels like, hey,
I agree.
we've got so many hours and sort of productivity hours back because all of these teams have one language to communicate, and it's not just JavaScript. It's literally just the component level itself. They can
Exactly.
they can write one stencil component. It's compatible with everything. It async loads. Everything
Yep.
works as expected.
Yep. Exactly. Yeah.
That's
Totally.
awesome. Yeah. So I hope more people do use Stencil. I know more people do. Like I'm gonna make lots. I'm gonna make some videos about it. I'm gonna make hopefully a course on it, and
Awesome.
just try and get the word out there because it is really an interesting sort of compiler.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
we get to other things like Avocado, which was mentioned briefly yesterday or the other day, whenever it was, in the Ionic
Friday.
show.
Yeah.
Yeah, Friday.
Yep.
So tell me a little bit about that, and tell me how it sort of fits into the Ionic and Cordova ecosystem. Like at the moment, if
Yep.
I want to interact with a native API, I have to write a Cordova plugin. I have to sort of interact with Cordova. Uh,
Yep.
what are you trying to achieve in the future regarding that?
Definitely. So I will say, warning, it is very, very early for avocado. So I'm not gonna dive into too many details,
Sure,
just because those details are still being fleshed out.
of course.
So I don't, it's exactly. So anything that I say today, it's
Could
possible that it could
change.
change
Yes.
tomorrow, because it's very early. But basically, the concept around avocado is, first of all, we're not, Cordova is great. Obviously, people have built tons of stuff on it. So it's not like Cordova is totally cool. But like I said before, and I keep saying it, like we're doing things the Ionic way, right? And like I said, it's the Ionic way to me is making things as easy as possible. So Avocado just kind of extends that to this native layer integration. So as you people probably know, Cordova allows you to interact with native functionality on the device from JavaScript, and Cordova also allows you to build a native app, an APK or an IPA on iOS that you can then ship to the App Store or Play Store. So Avocado allows you to do those same things, but with some key differences. So first is we're kind of going back to the old school Fire or PhoneGap days, where we're embracing things like Android Studio and Xcode. So instead of, I find that in computer science a lot, you can abstract things away so to the point where things are so abstracted that first, if something breaks, it's in so many layers of abstractions that it's actually like hard to find where the actual issue is happening, and also that you can abstract things away to the point where it actually becomes harder because there's so many abstractions that you didn't have to learn to make something work. When if maybe it was a little less abstracted away, it would be easier to use because there's just less to know. So we're kind of taking some of the things that we learned about Cordova and tweaking them to be more the Ionic way. So we're making things simpler. We're going to have a nice consistent API between the native side and the JavaScript side to make it easy for a developer who may not have written native code before to be able to write a plugin that interacts with something on the native side. And we're also going to have a really nice JavaScript SDK on the web side of things that allows you to call into these plugins. It's obviously still going to be a web view, where Ionic is based on the web. So we'll still be using like Chrome Web View on Android and WK Web View on iOS. But we're just modernizing things. We're making things more, the Ionic way. And I think it's going to be pretty cool. And there's some other key things too. So like we're moving, because we're kind of simplifying things. We're also making it so traditionally, if you have a Cordova app and you decide that you want to deploy that Cordova app as a PWA, traditionally, as it sits now, you have to make a few changes to your code. You have to do some feature detection to say, hey, am I on Cordova, or hey, am I on the web? If so, do this. If so, do that. We're making that way simpler to where you write one API and the am I on the native side or am I on the JavaScript side or on the web side is handled by by Avocado itself. So yeah, that way you can easily or more easily ship your Cordova app as a PWA. And there's some other cool things. I could keep going on, but there's cool things like so on the native side, if you want, if your app is running as a Cordova app or as a native app, you can say, hey, I want to, maybe I want to use the native alert. And you can, like I said, write that one API, and it'll show the native alert on a native app and a web, their traditional Ionic alert that you already know and love on the website of things. Yeah, it's. I mean, I could go on for days, but it's basically just taking the native layer that has always been there in Ionic apps that were shipped to the Play Store, App Store, and just making it more, making it follow the Ionic way pretty much.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point there with the sort of, on iOS or Android device, we'll show that native alert, but on the web, we'll show the maybe Ionic alert. So
Yep.
that gives us like so much more flexibility there because I imagine we can then make a PWA, we can make Electron apps this way, we can make Ionic apps this way, and all using that same technology.
Exactly. Exactly.
So it allows us, maybe we're a big enterprise and we want to sort of have this one product, we can deploy that pretty much everywhere and we don't really have to worry as much about calling platform.ready or, do you know what I mean, or sort of having
Exactly.
plugin not available appear somewhere.
Exactly.
So that does seem like it's going to be a really big thing.
Yeah, definitely. And I also one thing that I forgot too is so a lot of those we looked at kind of like the core Cordova plugins that people use pretty consistently in every app. So something like the keyword plugin, for example, that's used in basically every app built with Cordova out there. Currently, so with Ionic, we do install it by default, but in a traditional just like vanilla Cordova app, it's something that you have to install. And even though it's very important to a good experience in a Cordova app, it is something it's not built in. So one of the cool things we're doing with Avocado is those core plugins, those like 11 core plugins that we know people pretty much always use. We're just building that in by default. So you don't even have to worry about installing the plugin or anything like that. Those core plugins that you those core native functionalities that you're always looking for are just going to be built in by default. Nothing to install or anything like that. It's just already there.
Yes, that gives so much power. That gives a lot. Let's try that again. That gives us a lot of power too, because when we sort of making our Angular applications, our Ionic apps, at the moment in our providers, we have things like status bar, we have things like stuff like that, which to a new developer, I mean, I'm not sure whether they would still exist, maybe in the sort of Avocado solution. But to a new developer, haven't seen these things automatically in our providers or imports or anything like that. It
Yep.
can be scary. So I think the more abstraction you can make to make things easy by default, and then if somebody wants to dive into these things and wants to sort of deal with the native interaction, they can. I think that's really good for the sort of standard developer that's looking to take advantage of stuff with Ionic.
Yep. That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, it's a very good goal. I'm completely on board with that. So Alex asks us a question: with Avocado, when you update anything non-web, the binary I assume will change, so you will lose hot push, which essentially means we have to
Yep.
repush that to the App Store. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that's actually correct with Cordova as it stands now too.
Sure.
Ionic deploy, it only works if you're only making JavaScript, HTML, CSS side changes. So you can't actually do a deploy if you make any changes on the native side of things. And this is for security reasons, and also so you don't face Apple's fury. um, so
Declined.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, you can only do a deploy if it's a JavaScript, CSS, or HTML side change, and that's not an Avocado thing. That's also true today with Cordova.
Sure. And I suppose people don't really have to, because they use Ionic, they don't have to be scared about this new templating ban by Ionic, by Apple, sorry.
Yep,
Because that's
exactly.
because that's the thing a lot of people have been asking me too. They're saying like, hey, well, we use a thing that's not the Apple's SDK. Is Ionic still going to be fine with that? And I imagine
Oh
the
yeah.
answer is still yes, of course.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, and actually, if you look at Apple just released a few days ago their top apps for 2017, and there were actually two apps on there that are built with Ionic. So Pacifica, which is like if you have like anxiety or stress issues, you can use it. It allows you to do tells you different coping strategies, etc. It kind of walks you through them.
Sure.
And then also Swerkit, which is a an exercise app. I could probably stand to use Swerkit. It's a very cool app, and it's built with Ionic, and it's one of the top apps on the App Store. So I should be clear. Ionic is not a template app. A template app is something that you install this or you download this native app that is basically pre-built for you. It's a very standard design, and then you just put some content in it basically. Ionic is not that. Ionic is a framework that allows you to build an app from scratch. True, there are templates that you can install and pre-built like Ionic templates or Ionic like on the Ionic marketplace and stuff like
Sure.
that. But that's still at the core not a template app. It's not a pre-built native app that looks very generic compared
Yeah, of
looks
course.
very generic.
Yeah.
So no, there's no issues. Ionic is not a template app. It's a framework that allows you to build mobile apps or web apps, I should say.
Well, that's good. I mean, it's just one of those things. I mean, people, I suppose, have always been dubious of, because I think wasn't there something ages ago, I think, with Apple where with HTML5 apps they were getting declined quite often.
I don't remember that specific case.
Yeah,
It's possible,
yeah,
definitely for sure.
yeah. I'm not sure what criteria it was, but perhaps people just weren't using the design guidelines, and that's maybe why. But yeah, but I think it's just one of those things. Whenever you're not using the native SDK, people always can get a little bit scared that perhaps what they're using doesn't fit with the status quo of the store. Because I suppose as far as they're concerned, they do have the right to just sort of you know declare a ban on HTML5 apps if they wanted to. Not saying that's
Definitely.
a good idea, but yes, of course. But
Yeah,
so
yeah, no,
yeah,
definitely for sure. And the cool, I mean, the thing to remember too is like you can use the iOS SDK to build an app, and if it's not up to Apple standards, you'll still get declined even though
yeah.
you're using their technology. So it all comes down to just making sure you follow their rules. And I'm a big PWA fan, so if you don't want to get declined by Apple, anybody can push anything to the web.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. What I mean, if you use Stencil, well, there we go. We get a really good PWA
Yeah,
experience.
there you go.
So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Unless anybody else has any more questions, I mean, I think we found out definitely a lot about the Ionic project. We found out a lot about Stencil and especially Ionic, the sort of company and overall goals of the future of where you guys want to go. I'm definitely on board with that. I think that's awesome. Somebody has said where Rashid has said, "Where's the best AdMob ads placement in an Ionic
Okay.
app?"
Yeah, so this is actually a really good question. So in a native app, it doesn't really matter as much. But so I'm a huge PWA fan, and on PWAs it really matters because honestly, ads pull in a lot of JavaScript, and that's going to really impact not only your first time to load, but someone's data plan, for example. So a lot of people or a lot of places where PWAs are really big, data is really expensive. And you don't want to be pushing a ton of ads that just takes up someone's data plan, loading like 3 different versions of jQuery or something, and blowing up someone's data plan. So I find that the best, and even on the native side too, even if you're, pushing a Cordova app to the Play Store, I find that if you can lazy load ads, that's going to be your best bet. So like on the web, there's a cool API called Intersection Observer. So this allows you to basically say from a very basic standpoint, hey, don't run this code until the user has scrolled to where it's actually in their viewport. So I've used this in some PWAs before. I put ads maybe down towards the bottom of a list or something like that. And then I use interception observer to say, hey, don't load the JavaScript for that ad until the user has actually scrolled over it. That way, if they never scroll over it and they may never make it to the bottom of the list, then they don't have to load that JavaScript. So yeah, if you can
Yeah, if you can optimize that, I think it's really
Yep,
good, isn't
if
it?
you can
Yeah,
optimize that, definitely you should. Ads pull in a lot of code, so you should definitely try to optimize it if possible.
yeah. I suppose it goes down the same thing when you sort of making PWAs as well, where we sort of want to make sure that like images are a big deal in a PWA, I guess, because if you haven't
Definitely.
compressed images, or maybe you're loading a load of images, you can imagine just how much of a difference it makes to your bundle. Like, so you might have this super quick app, but it's lazy loading images is a really important thing too.
Yep, and I have a web component that I built Stencil called st-image, and that actually uses the interception observer to lazy load images. So you should check it out.
There we go. So we just stencil for everything. Intersection Observer, that's a relatively new API, I think, isn't it? Has that got a decent support?
It's relatively new. It has been out for a little while. I can pull it up in Can I Use real
Yeah,
quick.
let's have a look.
The support is actually pretty decent. So let me pull it up here. Yeah, so we have support in Edge, Firefox, Chrome. Looks like Samsung Internet supports it. So it looks like the two browsers missing out is Safari and IE.
Doesn't really surprise, but yeah.
But yeah, it looks like Safari and IE. But the cool thing is, so like ST-image. Actually, this is a slight tangent, but I think it's important. So Safari pretty much only runs, when you think about it, Safari pretty much only runs on really high-end devices, right? So like an iPhone 10, for example, that has a better CPU than my Surface Book that I use. It has a better CPU than it's an
Yeah,
insane CPU. So I
sure.
think you can get away with, you know, loading bigger images and stuff like that, not lazy loading images on a device that runs Safari more than you can a device that's something that runs Chrome or Firefox, because Chrome runs on everything from $100 Android phones that are a
Sure.
really great experience for their cost, or $800 something Pixel 2. Yeah, so even though Safari doesn't support it, like in ST-image, I just do some feature support detection, and then I just say, hey, if it's not supported, just go ahead and load the image.
Yeah, because if you're saying that iOS and probably Edge don't support it, then you're probably not in the worst situation there at that point.
Exactly, yeah, and actually, it looks like Edge supports it. It's just not IE,
Oh, so
and I
sorry,
mean,
yeah, it's the IE that was
yeah,
yeah.
and IE doesn't really support anything. So
That's true. No, but don't use IE. This is just a public service announcement. Just uninstall it. Just change your operating system entirely and fine. So just another quick one, I suppose, while we're talking about PWAs and performance, because I know you're really into this.
Yep.
When it comes to running sort of these lower end devices, so we are talking about these $100 Android phones here, PWAs have to be really important for that, surely.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. So this is actually you'll hear me talk about this on Twitter all the time. So here in the U.S., we're really it's really cool that the majority of people, and this may be a generalization, and I don't mean it to, but a lot of people have really nice devices. They have really cheap data plans, and a lot of people just have Wi-Fi. So I'm on Wi-Fi like 90% of the time, so I don't spend barely anything on my data plan. But we got to remember, outside of our, developer bubble, a lot of people don't have those. So a lot of people don't have, access to Wi-Fi, and a lot of people don't have, an $800 Pixel 2 and unlimited data and stuff like this. A lot of people have $100, Moto G or Moto E. They might have a few gigs of data, and the storage on that device is just a couple of gigs. The RAM is 1 gig of RAM. The CPU was a lower end Snapdragon CPU. And that, when you look at the specs, when you look at the stats, that's actually the average device that runs Android. The average device that runs Android has 1 gig of RAM and I can't remember the exact CPU clock, but it's a very slow CPU
Sure.
by what, we consider modern standards. And when you build experiences, so the web runs everywhere, and it runs on those devices just like it runs on a Pixel 2. you want your experience to be able to be used by anybody. And I'm totally guilty of this. For a long time, I did most of my testing on high-end Nexus devices, right? And hey, my app works fine on my device, but when someone when someone tries to pull it up on the average Android device, it might be extremely slow, or it might be just hammering the CPU, or it might be hammering the network stack. And at the end of the day, I just think it's kind of unfair, right? So yeah, I always push people. And that's one of the driving goals behind like PWAs. So PWAs on average use much less storage than a native app. When you think like the APK for Facebook is like 40 something megabytes, when the web version pulls in like 40 something kilobytes. That's a huge difference. And then the native app is going to be using tons of RAM, et cetera, compared to the PWA. And so that's PWAs are a big deal when you have a lower end device like that, because it's going to be more sensitive to your data plan. It's going to be more sensitive to your storage, et cetera. And just while I'm on this, I should say that like if you can, always try to test on a lower end device. Because if you're testing on your MacBook Pro that you have at work, a MacBook Pro can churn through tons of JavaScript compared to a mobile device. So you should definitely always try to test on the lowest end device you can. I have a first generation Moto G that I do I do a ton of testing on everything that I build, especially PWA wise, always gets tested on that phone. And the cool thing is if you can optimize to be fast on a first generation Moto G, then if you pull out your Pixel 2, it's going to be blazing fast. So it's very important. I think it's always test your stuff on an actual mobile device.
Yeah, that's really important, and it's something I have thought about in the past, and I've definitely considered, and I've worked with a lot of the things that you speak with. So, for example, in the past, we were deploying this crime management application out to these tablets that we had at work, and you can imagine when you're a public organization such as a police force, you don't really get iPads. You don't really have sort of a device
Definitely.
which you can spend a lot of money on. So we had these old
Exactly.
Samsung tablets. I think it was the A something, or do you know what I mean? It was one of the rugged work device ones. And I did notice, like, this is Angular JS and Ionic 1.x at this point, but I did
Yep.
notice that, like, the performance when we did run it on an iPad and when we did run it on a higher end device would substantially change. And it's something you can
Oh
easily
yeah.
take for granted, because I think we as developers often think, like, hey, we're able to deploy for Android and iOS and that type of thing. So everybody has the same experience, right? Because when we look at it, you know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
So, but everybody has the same experience. That's what it's easy to think. And I think unless you really do have like the sort of I don't know whether you want to be so ghetto and use console.time or whether you want to, unless you are really tracking that performance benchmarks and you're really into that, I think you can easily take that for granted where you don't where you don't literally focus on that. So it is really
Yeah.
important, and I do think projects like Stencil, when you are talking about lazy loading and async rendering and all these different things, that is going to help push the boundary so that more and more people can just get that by default.
Exactly. Yeah, that is the whole point behind Stencil is that default. So that and it sounds kind of funny, but a lot of people like it doesn't really cross your mind, right, to test on a mobile device because like even with Ionic, you do Ionic Serve, you're building your app, it's running really fast on your MacBook Pro, and to you it's a good experience. But
Yeah,
then you deploy that to a Moto G, and it's just good. It could be entirely different.
yeah.
And that's not really yours as a developer's fault when really if we had better defaults then it would be easy. So that's the whole like point of like moving to Stencil and stuff like that is that the defaults that you should be doing but it's that you should be doing are just built in by default. That way you don't have to think about it and you have a better chance of like developing the app and you install it on your or use it on your Moto G and it's probably going to be fast out of the box.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. We have a
Yep.
question in the chat about UC Browser. What is your
Yeah,
opinion on
so
UC Browser and that approach?
UC Browser. So I just read that they released PWA support. I think that's freaking awesome. So apparently they have add to home screen now. They have service workers, push notifications, etc. I think that's awesome. And it's just one more browser that you can install on an Android device that has PWA support. I can't say that I probably should honestly, because I know it's used by a lot of people, especially in China. Um, I should probably test more on UC browser. But as far as I know, at least the Android version has pretty good HTML5 support. And obviously they have service workers now too. So yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah, I think it won't be long until everybody supports that. I think there is an initiative with Safari to, of course, support service workers and get that spec
Yep.
sort of implemented in that end. So I think once we have like 100% support, and I suppose, and it's a lot of the sort of discussion revolves around this too, isn't it? Where like it doesn't matter that iOS doesn't support service workers because you should be implementing the principles of service workers and the principles of the fast web anywhere. Do you know what I mean? So like
Yep.
it
Definitely.
doesn't matter. Like so you shouldn't just like write off service workers because Safari doesn't sort of implement that.
Oh yeah, no, I totally agree. So this is one thing I always like to say too. Like, so Safari, just to be clear, is implementing service workers. It's in technical preview right now, Safari technical preview. It's not totally there. It's still broken. They're still working on it though, so I wouldn't expect it to be totally there
Yeah,
yet.
of
But it is
course.
coming, and they're moving pretty fast on it from what I can tell. But in the meantime, yeah, like you said, Paul, like a service worker does provide you, cool functionality like push notifications, dynamic caching, etc. But you don't need a service worker particularly to build a good web experience. Like you can still, if you follow best practices of like not loading tons of JavaScript up front, having compressed images, lazy loading those images potentially, etc. You can still build a really nice web experience on an iOS device that runs fast and works great. So I recommend like if you have an iPhone, go to twitter.com or pinterest.com. Those are PWAs. I get push notifications from Twitter on the Twitter Lite, the PWA version on my Android device. But you can pull it up on an iPhone and it's still a really great web app. And one of the words in progressive web apps is progressive. So what that word means is that as the app, if the app runs on a device that has certain functionality, then you can kind of upgrade that user to get that functionality. So like if you pull a Twitter Lite up on an Android device, then you can opt into push notifications. And then on a device or a browser that doesn't support, service workers and push notifications, then you just, degrade gracefully and you don't give them that option, but you still give them, the rest of the functionality of the app. And I think that's pretty cool because then like as Safari does support service workers, then when Safari ships that support, then people who build or people who use Twitter Lite on an iOS device will, immediately get that support. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I think people, I mean, if you look at using Twitter Lite and the experience is super quick in comparison to the native app anyway, like, and
Exactly.
you know, yeah, and I think this is the thing, isn't it? It's kind of where like, people are paying a bit more attention now to, or at least should be, following the sort of progressive web app guidelines to performance and really making sure that we have good web experiences because for the longest time if you considered JavaScript just a sort of this client side like sort of language that lets us make alerts. It's much different now. I think the sort of the ecosystem and the landscape is very much different.
Yep, definitely. Yeah, I totally agree. A progressive web app, it's a good like marketing like naming thing, but really, I mean, all it means is that you should be like, you should strive to create like the best web app experience that you can, and make sure that it works for everybody and not just on a MacBook Pro.
Yeah, and exactly. And a lot of things when you go start to try and implement these guidelines, you find out that actually a lot of the work that you're doing doesn't necessarily have to be in the service worker. A lot of the time
Exactly.
you are doing network profile and you are start looking at your time to load, you are like looking at your time to interactive. You're doing a lot
Yep.
of work, which at the end of the day it comes down to design decisions that you make as a sort of developer.
Exactly.
So when we talk about testing on all these different devices, and we have a Moto G, we've got an iPhone 10. I heard there's an Ionic app that helps us with that, and it's not
Good.
Ionic View.
Good plug. Good plug. I like that. So yeah, we just recently announced. This was a couple of weeks ago now. The Ionic Dev app. So Ionic View. A lot of people actually used to use Ionic View for this use case. So Ionic View is an app that allows you to so you can like push an app that you're working on up to Ionic Pro, and then you can share that app using Vue. So one good use case that I find is like if I'm back when I freelanced, I could use Ionic View. I could build an app, and then use Ionic View to share that to my client that I was working for, and then they could not just, not looking at screenshots and stuff like that, but they could actually use the app right there, and they could tell me like, hey, I don't like the color of this button, or if you push this button, this should happen, or something like that. Um, so Ionic View is perfect for that. But we found that a lot of people were trying to use Ionic View for native development. So, you start using Cordova plugins, they only work on a phone. Instead of the old, Ionic, or, run Android dash dash prod. Okay, something's wrong. Let me make some changes. Ionic Cordova run Android again. That's not the fastest, that's not the fastest way to dev for sure. So we built this thing called the Ionic Dev App. So what the Ionic Dev App does is you install it to your phone. It's out there on the Play Store and the App Store. You install the app to your phone. You make sure that you're on the same network as your computer is, so your development machine. You run Ionic Serve, and the Dev App will automatically detect that Ionic Serve and show you in the list of apps that you could have there, show you the app, and then you can simply click on that item. It pulls the app up in your the Dev App, yeah, you can start developing. So it has all the cool things you get from Ionic Serve, so like live reload, instant build. So you make a change, you hit save, and it rebuilds for you. But also have access to Cordova plugins. So it's basically like Ionic View, but for app development and not really just like app review. So yeah, just quick overview. Ionic Serve, pull it up in the Dev App, click it, and then you can continue to use that live reload development process that you're used to, but also have access to Cordova plugins.
Yeah, it's really good because it allows us to obviously test that use case that we were talking about with the Moto G and the iPhone 10 and all that type of things.
Exactly.
And we can see that, look, hey, this device is not really performing very well. Like this,
Exactly.
when I click this button, this animation, like it just doesn't work. You know what I mean? I've been there, and I've been there in the circumstance too with Ionic View where I've had a client and I'm basically working freelance and I'm trying to show the client, but you know what, this plugin doesn't work. So we get the message from the client like, hey, this kind of doesn't work. But in reality, it's just a sort of limitation of Ionic View at that point. So you're saying essentially Ionic Development wouldn't have that because there's more support for select Cordova plugins again, but just a bit more. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So okay. Yeah. So it's still limited to the plugins that we have installed in the app, but we've increased the amount of plugins that we have installed by default tremendously. And we've actually increased the amount of plugins in Ionic View too. So we have tried to cover all of the most common plugins that people use. And also not only the most common plugins people use, but also the ones that we have a lot of people request.
Sure.
So the latest version of Ionic View includes way more plugins than it used to, and Ionic Dev App includes a ton of plugins out of the box. And this is probably kind of dangerous to say, but for like 95% of use case, I think you'll probably have the plugin in either Dev App or View.
Yeah, so that's good because I mean I'm talking like we're going back a year or so here when I last used that
For sure.
for that use case.
For sure.
But yeah, that's definitely an interesting thing, and I suppose like with the Ionic Dev App, you do have that ability to, of course, have a tablet version up, a mobile version up, and any change you make, it's automatically sort of in there, and that's definitely great.
Yeah, definitely.
We have a question. Can I use Ionic 3 to read user fingerprint from biometric device? That's
a good question.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. If there's a Cordova plugin out there, then you should be able to. It probably depends on what exact device you're talking about, etc. If there's not a plugin, you can always write a plugin for it if you're familiar with native code. But yeah, it just depends on exactly what device you're talking about. And you may have to do a little bit of Googling to see if there's a Cordova plugin for it yet.
When it comes to sort of Cordova plugins, I get a lot of questions about this in a sort of similar sense, actually, about how do we sort of interact with this native API. Is Ionic looking at sort of resources about how one can go and write their own Cordova plugin and sort of have their own native integrations? Or is this just a resource thing?
So we're actually looking at that for Avocado.
Sure.
So like I mentioned before, we are creating one of the goals with Avocado is to make sure that it's really easy to write plugins for it too and interact with native features. That way you don't run into situations like that where this person has a biometric device that they're trying to get a fingerprint from, but there's not a plugin out there for it yet, and that person may not have really good Java or really good Swift or Objective C experience. So one of the things we're looking at with Avocado is to make sure that it's really easy to build, access those native features. So we're, making sure that the native side of things, that the SDK for that is a really good API, and trying to keep it as similar to the JavaScript API as we can.
Yeah, because I think that is one of the big things, isn't it? Whereas, you're trying to make this app and you're really good at JavaScript and you can sort of implement the app, but maybe there's not a plugin that you need. And I think
Yep.
that's a lot of the edge cases where people then break down. And, for a lot of people, when you're trying to onboard, not necessarily Ionic, just being interested in programming and the career
Yep.
itself, I think it can be a hit to a lot of people's confidence when they get there and they say, you know what, I want to implement this thing, but, now I've just got to go down this whole other path that really
Yep.
all I want to do is just, you know, load up the camera. It's an
Exactly.
example. Do you know what I mean? I know there's a camera plugin, but just load up the camera.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think yeah, definitely. So when it comes to sort of Avocado again, I'll jump back into this. When we're talking about interfacing with native APIs, are we talking about doing that from the Swift and Objective C level, or are we talking about from a sort of JavaScript intermediary at that point? Or is that
Yeah,
not?
definitely.
Do you not know yet?
So kind of both actually. So, for example, let's say that the Pixel 3 comes out and it has some new feature, or actually, so let the Pixel 2, for example, introduce this new feature to where you could squeeze the sides of the device. Currently, it's locked down to just open a Google Assistant. But let's say that they open up that API to where anybody could say, any app could say, okay, squeeze the size of the device and my app will do something.
Sure.
So let's take that example. So there's probably not a Cordova plugin out there for that yet. That Pixel 2 just came out. If they would have opened up that API, there may have already been a plugin for it, but I kind of doubt it. And that would be a use case for a lot. So a new device comes out, or the next version of Android comes out and implements this new feature, etc. Normally with Cordova, if you didn't have that native experience, you would just have to wait until somebody did build that plugin, and that's not exactly great when you're trying to push something into production or something like that. So that's where the native side of Avocado comes in. So we use our native SDK to be able to interact with those APIs or that feature or whatever. But our SDK, technically you're writing Swift, technically you're writing Java. But we've written this SDK to be as simple and as close to the JavaScript API as possible. So you write the native side of it, and then you use actually currently it's very uses an API similar to web workers where you post message, and then you can call that little bit of native code that you just wrote from the JavaScript side. And because we're keeping the APIs very similar, your code will look, like I said, extremely similar. So Avocado is, so like I said, normally with Cordova, you'd have to wait on somebody who has true native, experience writing native code. And that you may not be comfortable with, and just waiting on them to implement the plugin and hoping that eventually they do implement the plugin. To Avocado, where we have tried our best to make it as easy to tap into that native functionality as possible. So hopefully that the little bit of native code that you have to write is pretty easy for you.
Yeah, and it definitely does sound interesting. I mean, the that exact thing. I mean, if we take Face ID as another example, with the
Yep.
iPhone 10, I mean that's a feature which I'm not sure whether there is a Cordova plugin available for it yet, but it's something that if I want to implement that on day one, because if you imagine you've got a client and this client is going to be really excited that Face ID's just
Oh
come
yeah.
out, super
For
excited.
sure.
They've just got an iPhone 10 themselves and they go, you know what, our app needs this, and you go, well, I kind of just can only really write JavaScript.
Yep.
And I've never looked at making my own Cordova plugin before, and this sounds super scary. And I still got to pay the mortgage at the end of the month.
Yep.
But definitely, so I can definitely agree with that sort of process. NativeScript itself, when we look at things, comparing it to Ionic,
Hmm.
it has some sort of JavaScript API in which we can sort of map the sort of Swift and Android sort of Java functions, but written in JavaScript. So we've got TypeScript support with that too.
Nice. That's cool.
that might be. I don't know whether it's something you've looked at as on your end, or maybe how it compares to sort of the view that you guys are taking.
Yeah.
Or basically just how do you think Ionic fits in with NativeScript? I mean, I don't really want to turn this into an Ionic versus NativeScript because that's what people ask me this every day, and the same question goes like it's up to you. Like it's whatever like
It
makes sense
really
for
is,
your
man.
project. Like
Yep.
whatever makes sense for your team. Um, but yeah, when I'd be definitely interested into sort of seeing the way that we can interact with the native APIs, and I'd definitely be um, up for learning more about that when obviously you have more information.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we could probably take something from NativeScript on that side too, right? So because NativeScript has been so focused on the native side of things, there's probably some thoughts or some ideas that we can take from that side and implement into Avocado. And I just will say, like, obviously I'm biased towards Ionic. But I think for NativeScript, if you're doing like if native focused apps, I think NativeScript is fine. And if NativeScript fits your use case and fits what your team wants to do, then I say you should go all for it. Maybe give Ionic a look, but if it fits your use case, then you should definitely use NativeScript. And I've seen some cool stuff built with NativeScript. And then hey, if Ionic works for you, if you like Ionic, if it fits your use case, then you should definitely use Ionic. It all just depends on what you want to do and what you like best.
Exactly, that's exactly what it's about, isn't it? I think it just comes down to what you do, what your interests are, and I think Ionic does offer so many components out of the box that if they do offer more components than something like NativeScript. So if you wanted to have this sort of say checkbox, for example, I'm not sure. I don't think there's a checkbox component by default in NativeScript, but just using it as an example, we can just pull in
Yep.
that checkbox because at the end of the day, it's just simply a web component or will be in the future. So like I said, it shouldn't be about Ionic versus NativeScript. It should be about how can we learn from these projects that are integrated with native APIs, and how can we sort of map that and push sort of I'll say the culture forward, the sort of the projects forward
Yep.
themselves, and that's what it's about. Really,
Totally
everybody
agree.
has the same end goal. I think of it doesn't matter what project you are, whether you're Fuse, whether you're Ionic, whether you're NativeScript. I think everybody's just looking to make the cross-platform experience much better.
Yep, excuse the slight language, but I always like to say that everybody's just trying to build cool shit, right?
Yeah,
And it
exactly.
it it just
So
depends on what you want to use.
yeah, exactly. So many people that got C# teams ask me like, "Hey, should we learn Ionic?" And I'm like, "Well, maybe, but you kind of got a C# solution with Xamarin, which
Yep,
it might be that like actually what, like Xamarin is just much better for your team at that point because everybody already knows the language and nobody has to retrain, and it kind of comes down to sort of where you are in your team, and I think it's so personal to each team, which it just becomes
definitely.
where you are at that point.
Definitely. I obviously am always going to tell people, hey, give
Of
Ionic a
course.
look. But it like you said, you said it perfectly. It's very, very specific to what you or your team is doing, what you're working on, what y'all know. If you're willing to learn something different, if you have the time and money to learn something different, yeah, there's a lot of factors, and I think all projects are cool.
Yeah, I agree. So for sure, I mean, Ionic is something that got me into programming when I first started. I started with literally Ionic 1.x. It made it in my dissertation even.
Nice.
so,
That is very cool.
so it
Very,
actually
very
made it in
cool.
my undergrad dissertation, which I got first class honors for. So that was good. But yeah, it
Very, very
was
cool.
like dissertation with Firebase, Ionic, that type of thing, and like I said before, it's all about the onboarding experience. About what, like you have these components that can get people really interested in the project, and then they become long-term fans and long-term users, and then eventually, hopefully, upgrade to Ionic Pro, and then use the whole
There you
stack
go.
of that's it, and use it within their teams to deploy projects. We do
Yep, there you
have
go.
a quick question here before we sort of wrap things up with what about debugging feature on dev app, because
Yep.
I know at this point, we can debug on the device using the Chrome Dev tools and stuff.
Hmm.
Do we have any sort of debugger experience when it comes to the Ionic Dev app itself?
Yep. So this is something we're actually actively working on. I know the pro team had a meeting about it this morning. Um, so it's a pretty challenging issue actually. So technically, when you install the dev app, you are running, obviously, the dev app itself is built with Ionic, so it's running in a web view. And then, it's loading other apps into that web view. So while the app you're loading into that web view is running a development build, so it would spit out console logs. The dev app itself is running a production build. So then you get into where this. So you try to inspect the app with DevTools, Chrome DevTools, and it won't actually let you inspect it because the web view or the code that it sees is production code. So it's looking at dev app itself. When really what we needed to do is to be able to look inside of that and look at the dev build app that you're working on. So like I said, it's a super challenging issue, way more challenging than you would think it would be actually. But it is something that we're looking into. I would say it is a slight limitation of the dev app now. I do think the dev app still brings a lot to the table, but debugging is definitely something that's like super important. We're looking into. It's a pretty challenging issue, but we're working on trying to find ways around it. On Android, it definitely should be easier, just because of how awesome Chrome DevTools are and Chrome Inspect, etc. On iOS, it becomes even more of a challenging issue. Just because iOS is a little bit more locked down, and the DevTools aren't as great, at least in my opinion, and don't have as many features, I should say, I guess. But yeah, it's definitely something we're looking into. If we do get it working, it's probably going to come to Android first, I would imagine. But we want to get it working across iOS and Android, so we'll see.
Yeah, I imagine that's super difficult. I mean, if anybody's ever deployed a sort of application to like a mobile device management system or like sort of enterprise level deployment, you'll know that running things in a container is never a good thing. So it's never a good thing. We had this issue before actually when we were deploying to production, when we run things in like an MDM in a container. Is that like when you have a secure container that is literally like encrypted and stuff, it's almost impossible to debug the app inside of that. So I can only imagine. I can imagine it may be a little easier when it's not in a secure encrypted container and stuff, but definitely it is hard. I mean, can't you just take the Chrome DevTools, put it in a Stencil package, put it in the app, so
I
mean,
mean,
open
yeah.
up the DevTools inside of the device inside the app, then you saw it.
So I think there is. So that actually isn't. Right? So there is. I know it's funny, but like there is a way where you could like with Electron apps like run
that's a good point. Yeah,
separately. But yeah, it's going to be a complex engineering issue. We'll see where it goes. And yeah, hopefully we can get it out there for people. If not, I would say DevApp still brings a ton to the table in my opinion. And yeah, hopefully we'll have a solution. And hopefully it doesn't end up being as crazy as packaging Chrome DevTools in the app itself. but we'll.
Yeah, that definitely sounds crazy. I mean, Sunblood says, thanks, Justin, for the great answer, and thanks, Paul, too. Well, I think we've had a lot of good discussion. I think we've talked about pretty much everything. I mean, we've gone over Ionic, Stencil, Ionic Pro, Avocado, PWAs. Is there anything that you would like to add? Is there any questions that you would like to sort of pose to the discussion, or are you all Ionic down?
I would say just follow me on Twitter. I'm at JustinWillis96. I follow Paul, so you can go into his followers and find me there. I'm always willing to help people. If you have a question, I may not be able to get to it that day, but I will try my best to be able to get to you and help you. I'm also always tweeting about some of the new things we're working on. I'm tweeting out demos constantly, etc. So if you're interested in Ionic or Stencil or web components or just the web in general, feel free to follow me. And yeah, I hope you enjoy my feed. And then you should yeah, that's about it. Follow me on Twitter. Yeah. Hopefully everybody's building cool stuff.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, Justin always posts about PWAs, so he's gonna. If you follow him, you'll have PWAs that load in like 0.8 milliseconds.
Definitely.
You can. But yeah, definitely check Justin's feed out. It's awesome. He's got an Ionic Hacker News stuff on there that I've seen before, built with Stencil. It's perfect. Ionic team is doing really exciting things. Incoming problems at just.
I know, right? I saw that.
If it's anything like my messages, then I can only imagine.
Yeah, and like I said, I always try to get to everybody. I may not get there. I do work at Ionic. I do have a dev relations job where I have to create content and stuff, but I definitely try to help as many people as I can.
It's about the broad strokes. So yeah, that's it. As long as you can
Exactly.
impact the most people, that's good. Right, thank you very
Ex-
much, Justin. It's been awesome. What we need to do is we need to get you back at some point, and you can show us how to do all the stencil stuff, and we can run through some projects together on stream. And I think that would
Definitely.
be really good. And we can sort of follow this conversation up with some programming. I think that would be awesome.
Definitely. I would love to do that.
Right, well, we'll work it out. Thanks a lot.
Yep. Thank you.
Cheers. It's been fun.
Yep. See ya.